Hello, friends, and let's get started.
Lauren stood in front of the bedroom mirror, examining two pairs of shoes in turn, as if her fate depended on them. Her husband's muffled voice sounded in the background as he stepped out of the shower. "Lauren, have you decided what time you'll be back?" he asked, raising his voice slightly to overpower the murmur of the water in the sink. She flinched as if she'd been taken by surprise. Glancing back at the bathroom door, Lauren held her gaze for a second, not answering right away. Then, gathering herself, turned back to her reflection. "I think I'll be home by midnight," she finally answered, trying to sound confident. He peeked out of the bathroom, wiping his face with a towel, and looked at her glumly. "Try your best, okay?" he said with pressure. "I just want you to be careful. You know what kind of parties there are. Do you promise you'll behave?" Reasonably? She rolled her eyes, though she tried not to let him see it. His concern was almost touching, but also irritating. He was cautious, always so prudent. At that moment, she wanted to throw off the chains of predictability, to do something unexpected, to feel that she was still young, still free. Yes, she answered a little carelessly, fastening her earrings. "Don't worry, it's just a party." His eyebrows raised. He turned away, muttering something to himself, and she pretended she hadn't heard. At this point, she knew she wasn't going to stick to the agreed-upon limits, though she didn't yet realize to what extent. In the kitchen, the clock ticked away, counting down the last few minutes before she left. Lauren walked to the mirror in the hallway, fixed her hair one last time, and examined herself carefully. Her reflection seemed to study her back. It seemed that someone other than herself was looking back at her from the mirror, someone who could afford more than usual, someone who had longed to go beyond the daily routine. Her husband came up behind her, took her by the shoulders, squeezed her a little. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" His voice sounded concerned, but also displeased, which she tried to ignore. "It'll be fine," she said, gently removing his hands. "Just relax and let me spend time with my girlfriends." He sighed, letting her go, and stepped back to the refrigerator to pour himself some water. Lauren saw that he was about to say something else, but changed his mind. She resolutely pulled on her coat, grabbed her purse, and opened the door. "I'll see you later," she tossed over her shoulder without even looking at him. She walked down the steps to the street, her heels tapping crisply on the pavement. The night air was cool, but impatience burned inside her. She felt different at this moment. Everything she was about to do felt both frightening and exciting at the same time. It seemed that all of her inner contradictions were colliding this evening, forming some vague but powerful current. Something was going to happen, something she couldn't predict, and that excited her more than anything else. The warm glow of disco balls danced across the walls and ceiling. The monotonous hum of conversations, laughter, and music clanged together in a rhythm like the breath of the club itself. Lauren squirmed in the plush chair next to the dance floor, holding her first glass of white wine. Her friends were already getting involved in the evening. Melissa was in the corner, showered with gifts and compliments. Shelley was waving a long cocktail and laughing out loud at the bartender's joke. Carolyn was already bravely throwing herself onto the dance floor, dispersing the couples with her laughter. Lauren smiled as she watched them, but her smile was more like a gesture of duty. She didn't feel free here, amid the lights and voices yet. "Hey, what are you so serious about?" Shelley, on dipping heels, walked over and handed Lauren a new shot of tequila. "Come on, this isn't a dinner party at Grandma's. Soften up, girlfriend." Lauren hesitated. She didn't like tequila, and alcohol wasn't her strong suit, but her hesitation was noticed by Carolyn, who was already back from the dance floor, flushed, covered in flakes of glittery powder. "Jesus, Lauren, you didn't come to church. Have a drink, relax." Or, "Do you need a pass from your husband?" Carolyn reached out and poked Lauren in the shoulder, laughing as if it were an old friendly gesture. Lauren, not wanting to seem boring or stiff, picked up the shot glass and drank it down. The searing taste burned her throat and brought tears to her eyes, but she just smiled broadly as she felt a warm wave spreading inside. Shelley shrieked happily, clapping her on the back, and Carolyn was already yelling to the bartender to pour more. The music got louder, or maybe it was Lauren who stopped hearing the extra sounds around her. Her feet began to beat out a rhythm, and her hands found the glass with the new drink, almost without conscious input. She felt the heat in her chest and the lightness in her head erode the tension that had built up over the past weeks. There were figures flickering on the dance floor, some kind of show going on stage, but she wasn't paying attention to it anymore. Shelley tugged her hand. Carolyn was already spinning in the center of the dance floor, and Lauren laughed and stepped forward, letting her friends lead her into the thick of it. Her heart raced faster. It was like an endless kaleidoscope. Bright lights, the smell of sweat, laughter, and musicians changing from one tune to the next. Someone handed her another shot glass, and she drank it without even asking what was in it. Her throat stung again, but this time she only smiled. She picked up the rhythm, let herself raise her arms, threw her head back. Her hair fluttered, glitter sprinkled on her shoulders. After a while, Lauren was already whispering in Carolyn's ear. "You were right. I need this. I feel different." She laughed, but her voice mingled with the music. Carolyn nodded, but her eyes glittered with a predatory gleam. Shelley, already holding 2 glasses in her hands, looked over, saw Lauren, and nudged her with her elbow. "Stay close. We'll show you how to have fun." Lauren laughed louder than she had ever laughed in years. She winked playfully at the people on the dance floor, mimicking the way Carolyn did. One couple, a man and a woman in shiny suits, began flirting with her, encouraging her to dance. Lauren shook her head at first, but then, succumbing to the general atmosphere, leaned closer to the man, throwing him a couple of jokes. He laughed and offered her his hand. No, she's mine." Carolyn intervened, pushing the stranger away. "Lauren, you should be dancing with me, not him." She took her by the arms, whirled her around. Lauren felt like the center of this little world, surrounded by friends, strangers, all those shiny, cheerful faces. Everything that held her back dissolved into the rhythm of the music and the clinking of glasses. At one point, she noticed Shelley talking animatedly to someone on the other end of the dance floor. Lauren, not realizing who it was, didn't pay much attention. She turned to the bar, ordered a new drink, and then leaned against the bar, catching the bartender's eye. The man, smiling, handed her a cocktail and whispered, "It's been a while since you've had a vacation, hasn't it?" She nodded, feeling her cheeks burn. Someone behind her clapped her on the shoulder. Carolyn came back and pointed to the stage where the announcer was shouting something into the microphone, inviting everyone to join the show. Lauren smiled, but her mind was already starting to flicker. What's next? What was she going to do? But the warm heat in her chest was pushing her to the dance floor. The club's host, a young man with a cocky look, clutched the microphone like it was the key to the fun itself. He hopped up on stage, his voice cutting through the music, causing the dancers to freeze in anticipation. And now, ladies and gentlemen, a contest for the bravest of the brave. Who is ready to show their drive and style? Who will risk igniting the room to get free drinks all night and access to our VIP lounge? Lauren just raised her glass to her lips, but froze when she heard the announcement. "Oh, this is going to be fun," Carolyn shouted, and her voice overrode the roar of the crowd. She grabbed Lauren's hand. "You have to go." Shelley supported her friend, her eyes burning. "Come on, Lauren. It's just a joke. We'll all be with you." No. Lauren hastily brushed it off. She tried to hide behind the back of her chair, as if it could be a shield against her friend's growing enthusiasm. "I can't. It's not for me." "You must, dear," Carolyn insisted, her voice becoming a little more demanding. "This is your chance to show how brave you are. When else are you going to try something like this?" Lauren tried to say something, but her friends didn't give her a chance. They surrounded her and started hugging her, coaxing her, pushing her towards the stage. Trying to run away, Lauren ran into the bartender, who winked at her, handing her a new shot glass. "Drink this," Shelley said, tucking her hair behind her ear. "It'll help you relax." It was funny, but Lauren was already feeling a little tipsy, and the new drink was finally making her resolve melt. She knew she'd berate herself for it later, but at the moment she was gripped by a strange mixture of fear and excitement. The host, meanwhile, strutted around the stage, encouraging the audience. "So, who's going to be first? Who's the bravest?" People shouted, clapped, whistled, raised their hands. But no one came out. "Lauren!" Carolyn shouted and raised her hand as if she was ratting out her friend. The host immediately noticed the gesture, ran to the edge of the stage, leaned over. "You there in the red dress? Come on, we're waiting for you." He pointed directly at Lauren, and all eyes suddenly fell on her. "No, I don't," Lauren started, but she was already being pushed towards the stage. People were backing away, letting her pass. Her friends literally shoved her onto the front steps. And then she was under the spotlight. The light was blindingly bright. Lauren felt the blood pounding in her temples. Her hands involuntarily clenched into fists. Her feet felt as if they were digging into the floor of the stage. "Come on," the announcer encouraged. "Just start with something easy." The crowd roared. Her friends whistled and clapped loudly. Shelley raised her glass, indicating, "Come on, we believe in you." Lauren took a step forward, looking around. The host gestured that she could start by removing her shoes. She took off one heel, and the hall buzzed. It was a strange moment. Her mind protested, but the crowd pushed her forward. Lauren removed the second heel and placed them next to the microphone stand. Then slowly, with an almost theatrical movement, she removed her earrings. The crowd exploded with applause. Lauren suddenly felt a strange sense of lightness sweep over her. "Now that's not bad," announced the announcer. "Who's ready to repeat after her?" Someone from the audience shouted out, "Take off your handkerchief." Lauren froze for a moment. She met her gaze with Carolyn, who nodded, encouraging her. Lauren slowly reached for her neckerchief, took it off, turned around, and wrapped the handkerchief around her arm as if it were her stage. The crowd around them roared as Lauren continued to turn around to the rhythm of the music with a smile. It was as if everything around her became secondary. Her hair flew to the beat, and the sensations rolled in like waves. The host, as if completely lost in the celebration, shouted her name and encouraged her. "One more step. Lauren, come on, don't stop." But at this point her mind was no longer listening. Only her body was moving, following its new rhythm. Each movement became more and more liberated. The audience roared, and Lauren felt a growing sense of freedom take over her. It was like a kind of release from all responsibilities, from the predictability of her life. The music hummed in her head, and every step she took, every movement now seemed more daring than anything she had ever allowed herself before. Just then another contestant approached her, slender, with long fingernails and eyes burning with excitement. She laughed and offered to play a game. Whoever got farthest in the contest would win. Lauren was a little taken aback, but looking at her confident face and the support from the audience, she decided to play along. The girl, clearly more confident, began to shed her clothes in a way that would attract attention. Lauren felt the pressure, but now she couldn't stop. Feeling herself on stage, she almost mindlessly followed the same path. Each of her movements became more provocative, more overt. The crowd began to shout her name, and Lauren felt her lips spread into a smile. With each step, each piece of clothing removed, she became more enthralled with what was happening. She removed her belt, then slowly pulled down her skirt. Her eyes lit up with sparks, and when, as if by inertia, she decided to remove the last element, she did not look back. On stage, in that bright light, Lauren was no longer in control of what was happening. She was one of those who, having started the game, do not notice how she crosses the line. The crowd was ecstatic, shouting her name, whistling, cheering. No longer having the slightest control over what was happening, she felt her body become the center of attention. The only thought in her mind was, "Now I can't stop." The girl opposite was trying to show off her assets, but Lauren felt her actions become more organic, as if she was at the peak of her power. She didn't see her clothes slowly leaving her body, leaving her without underwear, but the audience noticed it and exploded with delight. Screams, applause, applause, applause all merged into one ineffable atmosphere. "Lauren! Lauren!" shouted the crowd. She felt her chest fill with pride. It all happened so fast that she didn't notice how she was the winner. When the announcer announced her name as the winner of the contest, she, almost as if in slow motion, raised her hands and responded with a gesture of gratitude, but in her eyes there was not only the joy of victory, but also a kind of confusion. How had she gotten to this point? She couldn't remember how it had started. The victory had been overwhelming. The spotlight was blinding, but Lauren, still groggy from the drink and the crowd's enthusiasm, only smiled. The host ran up to her with microphone in hand, his face glowing as much as her own. "All right, friends, we have a winner. Lauren, you are the true queen of the evening tonight," he proclaimed, raising her hand in the air as if she had just won the boxing title. The hall exploded with applause, whistles, and shouts. Carolyn and Shelley, cheering, rushed toward the stage, waving their phones. "You did it!" Carolyn shouted. "That was just incredible!" echoed Shelley. Lauren laughed, swaying slightly. Her legs were still unsteady from dancing, but now she felt strong and somewhat free. The host stepped closer, smiling with a sly light in his eyes. "Lauren, you've earned your prize. We want you to meet our star entertainer. He's already waiting for you in the VIP room. You're going to love it." Lauren froze. She looked back at her friends. Shelley was encouraging her with a look, and Carolyn clapped her on the shoulder. "You have to go. This is your moment. When else are you going to have this opportunity?" She hesitated a little, but the thought flashed through her mind that it was simply impossible to back out after an evening like this. "Well, all right," she said with a half-questioning intonation. "You deserve this," the host announced, making an inviting gesture. Carolyn, keeping up, picked up the phone. "We're going to capture the whole thing. This has to go down in history." Lauren only grinned slightly and followed the host, trying to look confident. The VIP room greeted her with dimmed lights and the slight scent of something exotic. In the center of the small room stood a tall man with an athletic figure and a charming smile. His eyes radiated that very mixture of professional charm and subtle personal interest, which immediately attracted attention. He held out his hand as if inviting Lauren to dance. "I'm Alex," he introduced himself in a voice that seemed a little deeper than one might expect. "I've seen you on stage. You held your own amazingly." Lauren, feeling her cheeks begin to burn, replied, "Thank you. It was an unexpected experience." He took a step closer. Meanwhile, Carolyn and Shelley were nestled in a corner with their phones, filming what was happening. They tried to stay out of the frame, but their giggles gave away their presence. "Haven't you ever been in a pageant like this before?" Alex smiled and nodded toward the stage. "No, never," Lauren replied, looking straight into his eyes. "I don't usually do anything like that at all." "Yeah, and that's why you ended up in the VIP room with the club's most popular artist?" His tone was both teasing and encouraging. Lauren laughed, her laughter sounding a little louder than she expected. She felt like Alex was lifting her spirits, and it was strange because she didn't know why she had come here, but now she didn't feel like leaving. "Well, you said yourself that I deserved it." She tried to joke back, but she heard her voice shake. Alex leaned forward slightly, his gaze growing serious for a moment. "Sometimes moments like this are the best things that happen to us," he said, then smiled again. From behind Carolyn, Shelley said quietly, "Do you see the way he's looking at her? She must be in shock." Shelley nodded, holding the phone so that the camera captured Lauren and Alex. "Let's get something to drink," Alex suggested, pointing to the bar in the corner of the room. Lauren hesitantly nodded. Her head was already feeling a little dizzy, but she couldn't refuse him. "I thought you were just an entertainer," she said as he held out her glass. "Well, I'm not just an entertainer." He smiled his trademark smile. "I'm also a man who knows how to find common ground with wonderful women." Lauren raised her glass, trying to hide her awkwardness. She glanced at her friends in the corner, who continued to skim and giggle, but in silence. Alex turned slightly toward them and nodded. "You could just enjoy the moment instead of capturing it on camera," he said, smiling, but his tone was firm. Carolyn put the phone down, pretending to capture only random shots, while Shelley concentrated on typing something on the screen. "You're the star here," Lauren said, trying to bring the conversation back to a lighter note. "Why do you waste your time on newbies like me?" "Because sometimes even stars need to feel like they're around someone real," Alex replied, lightly touching her shoulder. His words were both flirty and thoughtful, and Lauren felt her pulse quicken. Her head spun harder, but she couldn't take her eyes off his face. Alex raised his glass and said, "Here's to unexpected moments." Lauren felt her world suddenly become even more confusing, but she raised her glass in response. In the casual semi-darkness of the VIP room, Their conversation gradually slowed. The laughter died down, giving way to long stares and silent pauses. Alex took a step closer. His smile was no longer just professional. Lauren felt the warmth emanating from him, as if he himself was part of the bright light of the club that she didn't want to turn away from. He leaned in slightly to say something in her ear, but no words came out. Their breathing mingled, and Lauren suddenly noticed that it was becoming difficult for her to focus on what was going on around her. Her own movements became slower, but it wasn't weakness, but a strange, unfamiliar confidence. Their lips met, and it was like a fall she could no longer stop. Somewhere outside the room, her friends were still discussing something in quiet voices, but it seemed so distant, like it was happening in another life. The light teased, playing on their faces, and the music hummed behind the walls like a pulse. Time seemed to stretch out. Soft touches, the warmth of someone else's skin, the feeling that her world had suddenly narrowed to a single moment. She no longer thought about what would happen next, and that moment, that contact, overshadowed everything else. Her hands glided unnaturally smoothly over his skin, his every gesture, every movement seeming unhurried, as if stretched out in time. He pulled her to him, and she didn't resist, but rather allowed herself to be absorbed by his attention. Everything around her was hazy, but his every glance was incredibly clear, full of some inexpressible attraction. He didn't speak, but his eyes said everything. In his arms, her body felt light, helpless, and she couldn't resist the way he took her farther away from reality with each touch. There was a kind of tense silence in the air, and all she could feel was his breath, his scent, his touch. Lauren noticed her own body, starting to respond to his movements, and she didn't want to stop. Her hair was falling over her shoulders, but she didn't notice it because she was absorbed in every action he took, every look he gave her. It was as if everything around her had slowed down. Her mind was in turmoil, and her body felt only one single need, to be near him. She felt his body pressed against hers, felt the weight of his arms. Every touch of him on her skin was like a spark, making her sigh tensely. A storm raged through her mind as her actions became no longer conscious. He was leading her, and she didn't want to stop. She seemed to have lost herself, but there was nothing wrong with that. The morning light shone through the blinds, spreading out in streaks across the room. Nate, still in his t-shirt and sweatpants, sat at the kitchen table. His cup of coffee, long since cooled, stood next to his laptop. On the table next to the keyboard was his phone. Its screen recently flashed with a notification. Opening the messenger, Nate saw that the message was from Melissa, one of Lauren's friends. "I don't know if you should see this, but I think you should know the truth," the short caption read. He frowned, feeling something clench in his chest. Opening the message, he saw the video. His fingers froze over the screen. It was that moment when you're warned it's going to be bad, but it's impossible to refuse to watch. In the video, Lauren stood on stage. She was laughing, dancing with her heels and earrings off, her face glowing with excitement, and something else. The video rewound from one scene to the next as Lauren took off her jacket, raised her arms, her movements becoming more and more uninhibited. In the background, the crowd shouted her name, and her friends stood by the stage, clapping their hands. Nate felt sweat break out on his forehead. He thought it was just part of some joke, but as he watched, his confidence melted away. He heard the announcer's voice, and now our champion makes his way to the VIP area. The camera turned to Lauren. Her face flashed with excitement, but then the video cut off. He paused for a second to take a breath. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the next message from the same Melissa. This time it wasn't a public video, but a private recording. Nate looked at the screen carefully, his heart racing. He didn't want to press play, but his fingers moved on their own. The video was what he feared most. A VIP room, the lights dim. Alex, the stripper, stood close to Lauren, their faces barely a few centimeters apart. They were talking, her laughter sounding louder than he could have imagined. Alex leaned in close to her ear. Then her hand slid over his shoulder. In the background, one of her friends, probably Carolyn, was filming everything on her phone. They were smiling and whispering. Nate froze. He felt his breathing become ragged. His heart was pounding so loudly it seemed to rattle the whole room. He didn't want to watch any further, but something compelled him to see it through to the end. The video ended with Lauren leaning closer to Alex, their faces almost merging, her hand traveling down his chest. Then the tape cut off. He set the phone aside and ran his hands over his face. Nate felt like his world was falling apart. The scenes he'd seen couldn't get out of his head. He wanted to drop everything, throw the phone away, erase that memory, but he couldn't. Everything he'd seen was firmly planted in his memory. He tried to get up, but his legs felt like absorbent cotton. The kitchen, which had always seemed to him the most peaceful place in the house, now felt like a prison cell. Everything around him reminded him of Lauren, the cup with her lipstick on it, the magazine she'd left on the table, her shoes standing by the entrance. Nate looked at them and felt a lump rise in his throat. His mind worked slowly, as if everything that was happening was a nightmare. He tried to understand how this was possible. She, his wife, who he considered his closest person, was in those videos. Lauren, laughing, dancing, touching another man. It didn't make sense. Her face, her movements, it was all there for him. And now he was seeing it on his phone screen like some alien movie. The sound of the messenger brought him to his senses again. It was another message. This time Melissa wrote, "I'm sorry you're finding out this way. I thought you should know the truth." Nate didn't respond. He sat in a kitchen chair, staring at his phone. The world he knew was starting to fall apart, but what to do about it? He didn't know. Lauren sat on the couch, fumbling through the hem of her robe with trembling hands. Her gaze wandered around the room, but never stayed anywhere for long. The silence pressed down like a concrete wall that didn't even have cracks in it. She could hear Nate pacing the kitchen, his footsteps seeming unaccustomedly loud, as if he were stepping on every creaky patch of floor on purpose. Something tinkled in the KitchenAid cup or a spoon. Then the sound of the refrigerator door opening. Lauren opened her mouth to say something, but that's when Nate walked into the living room. He had a cell phone in his hands. He stood in front of her without sitting down, only tilting his head slightly as if trying to figure out what to say first. But his gaze said more than words could. There was disappointment, hurt, and something else she couldn't quite pinpoint. Perhaps it was something close to contempt. Her own heart sank. "I thought we were a team, Lauren," he finally said. His voice was calm, almost quiet, but there was a power in that silence that was hard to miss. "And now I'm looking at this." He held up the phone, as if showing me a clue, "and I don't understand who you are." Lauren looked away. Her eyes darted to the window, then to the armrest of the couch. She wanted to answer, but her tongue felt like it was stuck. "Nate, I don't even know how to explain this," she started, but he held up a hand, silencing her. "Just tell me one thing," he interrupted, taking a seat across from her on the coffee table. "Why? Why did you do it? Did you think I wouldn't find out? Or did you think I wouldn't care?" He tried to remain calm, but his voice still shook on the last word. Lauren noticed it and clenched her fists as if trying to keep control of her own emotions. "It's not what you think," she said, glancing at him quickly. "Nate, I had a drink, too much to drink, and my friends pushed me. I didn't mean to. It was just, I don't know, an accident. I don't know how it happened myself." His eyebrows furrowed. Nate ran his hand over his face, as if he wanted to erase her words along with this conversation. "An accident?" he repeated with a bitter chuckle. "Accident is when you drop your phone in the water. It's not an accident, Lauren. You knew what you were doing. You went along with it." She shook her head, hardly noticing that tears were starting to form in her eyes. It wasn't despair, more the realization that her words weren't getting through to him. "You don't understand," she tried to explain. "I didn't mean to. It just happened. I wasn't myself. You have to understand." "No, Lauren, you have to understand," Nate interrupted sharply, his voice hardening. "You crossed the line, and now I can't just forget about it." He stood up, took a couple steps toward the window, and stood with his back to her. Lauren saw him staring off into the distance, into a void that was nothing but a reflection of his own frustration. She tried to get up, but her legs wouldn't obey her. "Nate, I love you," she said, sobbing. "I really love you, and I'm ready to make things right. Just tell me what I can do." He turned sharply, his face now a mask of cold determination. "Do you love me?" he said, approaching slowly. "How do you show it?" By dancing naked on stage, in front of a crowd, kissing, and having fun with someone in the VIP room? Lauren, love isn't words, it's actions. And your actions tell me differently. She was silent, trying to hold back the flood of tears that were no longer possible to hide. But Nate didn't even look at her. He went to the door, opened it, and said without turning around, "I can't be with you after this. I just can't. You have to get out of my house." For the first time in her life, she didn't know what to say. An hour later, Lauren was already sitting on the suitcase by the door when Nate walked into the hallway. His face, tired and devastated, didn't reflect the slightest regret. He glanced at her briefly, as if checking to see if she was finished. A tension hung in the room that Lauren tried to avoid but couldn't escape. "Is that it?" he asked, leaning against the door jamb. His voice was flat, almost indifferent, as if he were talking to a stranger. Lauren nodded nervously, not looking up. "Nate, she began, but he raised his hand sharply. "Don't, Lauren. No more explanations. We've talked this through. You're leaving. That's the end of it." Lauren pressed her lips together, lowered her head, and stood up. She didn't try to argue, didn't try to justify herself. Words were meaningless. She took the suitcase by the handle, took another look around their shared home, now past, and stepped toward the door. "I hope you find what you're looking for," Nate added as he looked at her. Lauren paused for a second, but didn't answer. As she stepped outside, she felt the cold morning wind touch her face. It was too late. Too many mistakes. She walked away without turning around. Nate closed the door and exhaled heavily. His fingers reflexively reached for his temples, wanting to wipe away the pain that had built up. He stood in an empty apartment that suddenly seemed too quiet. Not the familiar smell of her perfume, not the sound of her footsteps. Just him and the silence. And that silence pressed on him more and more with each passing moment. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. Nate flinched and went to open it. Melissa stood on the threshold, slightly disheveled, but with warmth in her eyes. She smiled awkwardly, holding a bag of coffee and croissants. "I thought you probably hadn't had breakfast yet," she said, holding the bag out to him. "I just thought I'd stop by and see how you were doing." Nate accepted the package, feeling that heavy feeling of loneliness go away for a moment. He gestured for her to come in. Melissa sat down on the couch, watching him carefully. Nate sat across from her, placing the package on the coffee table, but didn't open it yet. "How are you?" she asked cautiously. Her voice sounded sincere, without a shadow of judgment. Nate looked at her, then looked away. "How can I be?" He spread his hands. "My life has been turned upside down. I don't even know what to do now." Melissa leaned forward slightly, her gaze filled with sympathy. "I know it seems hopeless right now, but it'll pass. You're strong, Nate. You'll get through this." He grinned bitterly, shaking his head. "You're so sure?" "I'm not even sure what I am now. I just don't understand how this happened." Melissa was silent for a moment, but then she covered his hand with her own. "We all make mistakes, but that doesn't mean life is over. You deserve to be happy, Nate, and you will be again." Nate looked up. For the first time in a long time, he saw genuine support in someone's eyes, not judgment or pity, but a real willingness to help. He felt something inside him begin to shift. Melissa sat across from him, simple, honest, real. She wasn't trying to impose, wasn't trying to heal his wounds with fake words. She was just there for him. And that's where today's story ends. Thank you for watching to the end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like and comment. We'd love to discuss this story with you. See you in the next video.